Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Betty Eats podcast, where we talk about real recipes created by real people. There's lots of AI stuff floating around out there right now, so it's always a pleasure to talk to people who are recipe developers and food writers. And today we have a special treat on the program. We have Georgia Freedman. Georgia is a journalist, an editor. She is a cookbook author, 5-time cookbook author, and she's also written for, wow, Georgia, I'm like amazed. You have written for Wall Street Journal, Martha Stewart Living, Real Simple, and then Saveur, where obviously you're a managing editor, and what a resume. So I'm super excited to talk to you today. Welcome. And so I want to actually start with your most recent project. You're working on a cookbook that is about to be released, and I find it very, very intriguing. It's called Snacking Dinners. So will you tell us about that first of all? Because I'm actually really excited about this cookbook.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on. It's nice to actually talk instead of typing to each other. This is lovely. So Snacking Dinners, I have my pre-copy, so I'm just so happy. It's so pretty. They did such a beautiful job. The designer and the photographer were amazing. Snacking Dinners comes out at the beginning of April. It was sort of a really quick project that came about sort of in between some other things. And every minute of working on it has been really fun. So I'm really thrilled about it. I don't know if you I realized I should have sent you a PDF of it, or, we can take a look at it. But it's the basic idea of Snacking Dinners is that I really feel that when you get home at the end of the day, sometimes you have a lot of time and you can make something nice for yourself and do everything really slowly. But on the nights when you don't have that kind of time, that doesn't mean you shouldn't eat well and that dinner can't be fun. I'm a real proponent of trying to make dinner fun because we need as much fun in our day as possible, especially these days, and easy. So that's sort of the basic idea of the book is food as nourishment, food as self-care. All the recipes are for one, because I think that when people are eating by themselves, they also don't feed themselves as well as they would feed friends or family. So that's sort of the basic idea of the book.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think you had shown, maybe it was just I don't know if it was a screenshot or kind of one of the pages in the cookbook. And I was like, gosh, that's so smart. I imagine that the kind of the target market for your audience is going to be a wide variety of people, is what I'm thinking. I was just thinking when my kids were younger and I was driving them, a million places and, soccer practice and all this kind of stuff. It's funny, we'd get home at 8 o'clock at night and it's like, who wants to pan sear chicken at 8 o'clock at night and make this big old dinner? And something like that, it seems like that would have been a perfect solution, just for kids on the go and things like that. And so,
yeah, that's definitely where the idea originated. I started making these kinds of dinners, especially when my daughter was really little and we were trying to get her to bed really early. I would start to give her, she had sardines on crackers once and loved them, and she was like 3. And I was like, okay, if you love this, we can do this, once every week or two with some crudité. And that just simplified my life so much. And then, various other versions of that happened. And then when she got to be a little bit older, she's turning 11 next week, actually. So she's a little older, and sometimes we split up who's doing what, and I'll have an evening to myself while my husband's taking her to gymnastics or something, that, some of these activities are in the evening. And I realized that I could eat foods that they don't like. I could make myself something that neither of my people will eat with me. And so this idea, when girl dinner became popular,
Yeah.
and I looked at everybody's plates and I thought, oh, ladies, do better for yourselves. Like, I mean, I get it. I totally sometimes have those nights where I'm just making popcorn, and there's popcorn in the book. Or, you're just eating the leftovers because it's as easy as it could possibly be, and you're giving yourself time. But I also feel like you can give yourself time, and in a 5 or 10 minute span, make yourself something special so that you're having a little time for yourself. That's sort of the goal. And then, of course, there's so many other people that applies to. It's not just, the moms with young kids. That's just where I'm at in my life and sort of how the idea came about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. I was thinking about even how older people, people in maybe like their late 60s or 70s or 80s, they eat their biggest meal earlier in the day. Like I think about my own mom, her biggest meals are breakfast and lunch. And it's just, it's harder to digest the later you go in the evening for older people. And so I think about the types of dinners that she eats. And they are things like, popcorn or, or apples and cheese, or, something really light and easy to prepare and not too much fuss. It's funny, an acquaintance of mine, she checks regularly on her mom who is older, and she's like, Mom, so, have you eaten dinner? What did you eat? And she's like, oh, I had a bagel and a margarita. And it's just like, okay, what are you eating right now? But yeah, I think that even just the older generation would really appreciate a book like this, because it's a solution with healthy options and, something fun, like you said, that feels like, ooh, this is a fun treat for myself too, so I love that.
My dad and his wife tested a couple of the recipes, and they apparently go back to those recipes all the time. I can't wait to give them the book, because it's that they eat their larger meals earlier in the day. And, they both cook well. They both have the time to cook. They're novelists, so they can control their schedules. But yeah, the lighter meal has been really helpful for them. And, often how we do that is we make something and then we eat small portions of it and leftovers. But just, and in the same way that some of my single friends have come up with schedules where they're like soup and eat it most of the week, you don't have to do it that way. All these recipes are actually designed for one. So that you can triple it if you have 3 people in your family like me. I can't cook a dish for 6 and get through it all in a week if we're not having people over. Or you can just feed one person at a time. So yeah, I'm hoping that there are a wide variety of uses. I also use these dishes for parties because you make a few of them and then they become little snacks. You take a couple bites of each.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So the book is coming out in April.
Yes.
Yeah.
April 8th, yeah.
Yeah, and people can pre-order too, which is great.
Yes, and actually on my newsletter at snackingdinners.com, the pinned post is the pre-order bonuses, because I was gifted by a number of companies some beautiful things, some beautiful cookware, some snacks, some ingredients, and there will be a raffle for that. And then a mixologist in LA did a handful of recipes that pair with recipes in the book. And so there's a PDF of drinks that you can do for free as part of like a pre-order bonus. So if people are thinking of getting the book, they should definitely sign up for the pre-order bonuses, because those are also really fun.
Yeah, wow, that's great. Oh my goodness. That's awesome.
No, they're fun, and I feel so lucky that people have been helping me with this, because I'm excited about the prizes. They're lovely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, let's kind of maybe take a step back and talk about how you got started in all of this. I mean, I was looking just over the list of cookbooks that you have written and co-written, and I thought, wow, I really love to hear her story. How did this whole thing come about? Take us back.
Sure. I mean, I have a degree in international politics, actually. Um, and so I had studied in Beijing for a summer in college and sort of fell in love with China and knew I wanted to move back there at some point. So that's sort of one of the paths that came in later. And then I was working in government after 9/11, and some of my work involved going to meetings about what the site should become, what the monument should look like, going to community meetings and hearing about what people were going through. And it was very valuable work, but it was also extremely taxing work. Um, and working in government was not as exciting as, I had worked for a couple different people, and some of the places got a lot done. Some people were really motivated, their staffs are really motivated, and then that's just not true of everyone. Particularly people who have been in positions for a very, very long time and kind of need things to stay the same. And that really, I was very disillusioned with that idea that we were, even with all this hard work that was going on, people didn't seem motivated. And so I tried out a few different things, and then I ended up just taking a step back and becoming a waitress, because I knew that I needed the time to figure out what I wanted to do. And I knew that I wanted to write. So while I was working front of house, I also started a food blog back when that was like a new thing to do, when there were a handful of us. And that food blog got me an internship at Saveur magazine because one of their editors started reading it. She was just scouting for what was going on in the world. And so that internship turned into 5 years in various positions at Saveur. So I went in as an intern, became an assistant editor, fact-checked a lot, helped organize the schedule, eventually became managing editor. I think it was 29. I don't know how that happened, but I do know how it happened. I understood everyone's jobs. It was a small team. Mm-hmm. I had been there in a capacity that let me see what everybody did. I'm a natural organizer, I guess. I had thoughts about how to make it run smoothly. And my boss at the time, Jim Oslin, said, you've done a really good job at being interim, Emmy. I think we'd like to keep you. And I was like, I don't know if I need to manage for the rest of my life. But I got to work with such amazing people, and the people I worked with at the time are still some of my closest friends. And it was really a gift because I got to learn in a really small environment, and so I got to learn a wide skill set. One of the editors went on paternity leave, so I ended up helping style a photo shoot that wouldn't have happened anywhere else. They would have had other people who could come in and do that. Wow. But, it was a small team. And so my hands are on the cover of that magazine a couple times. Everybody was doing things. So it was a really good education in food journalism and in magazines and in putting projects together. And I think all those skills then turned into this very sort of ranging career that I have, where I do a little bit of everything because I have all of these things and I love all of these things. I love editing, I love writing, I love the process of putting a project together. So I think it all comes out of that. And then I moved to China for a couple of years, started the reporting on my book Cooking South of the Clouds because I wanted to get back to China and to Yunnan province specifically. And then my family's in California, so I moved back to California and started freelancing. And my best friend is a rancher, so I wrote her book, and over the process of visiting her family for many years, learned a lot about agriculture and ecology and sort of developed contacts in that community. So now I spread all these things around and I do a little bit of everything.
Wow. And it seems like, I don't know, it just seems like everything you did sort of built on each other in a way. It was like, oh, let me take some of this from my other, things that I did and kind of move it forward. But it almost sounds like too that each of your cookbooks was a labor of love in a different way, because it was something that you were really connected to, which is, yeah.
And I'm a generalist. I don't, people are always talking about personal brand, but that wasn't a thing 15 years ago. And so it never occurred to me that I needed to pick one thing. And I don't want to pick one thing. It's fun to learn new things and
Yeah.
to, develop expertise in a lot of areas. So my first cookbook is There's Always Room for Chocolate, and I wrote that on behalf of the Chocolate Room in Brooklyn. And I did that because I wanted to learn how to write a cookbook before I did my Chinese book, which was also underway. But also, I loved that place. I loved the Chocolate Room, and I was not a very good baker. And I thought, this is how I'm going to become a good baker. I'm going to stand in that kitchen for 2 weeks at a time and ask all of the questions. And
Right.
then what I learn goes into the book. So, the book has the perspective of someone with all the questions. And then my second book was the book that I researched in China over the course of like 8 years. And then the third was with my good friend, the rancher, who has a TV show on Magnolia Network, which is fun. Snacking Dinners is the fourth. And then I'm currently writing a book with the team at Single Thread on their behalf up in the Michelin Star restaurant up in Healdsburg. And they have a farm. They work very closely with all the producers for the food that doesn't come from the farm. And they have this very interesting, beautiful food that they make. So it's all the different pieces coming together in that book as well.
Wow. Now, did you, it sounds like you've had a long interest in food, but did you kind of grow up cooking? Like you learned it from, like family, a mom or grandma or anything, or not really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mom is an excellent cook. My mom is a really good cook. Everything she makes, just like, she has a very good sense of flavor. And, she'll use cookbooks, but a lot of the time she just takes an idea and develops it herself, which is really sort of how I think I learned to develop that sense of flavor and taste and knowing what goes with what. And then after college, I cooked for myself in the dorm, but, eggs and things, very easy, and things, eggs used to be cheap. That used to be a cheap way of getting protein. And, like everyone, of my age, I was watching the Food Network and I was trying to learn that way. And then I got this job. And then one of the reasons that I ended up in food was that during the job in government that I didn't love so much, the New York Times food section came every Wednesday in paper, of course, and I just was obsessed with it. I could not wait to get that section. And I just started cooking through that. I started cooking through magazines. And then as I started reporting on food, I got the opportunity to just hover over people in their kitchens and ask questions and write things down and be like, oh, that kind of looks like it's 2 cups. We'll try out 2 cups and see if it tastes right. So it's been a very sort of a windy road to learn to cook, because I never went to culinary school or anything, but lots of teachers. I've had many teachers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think windy roads make it interesting too, Yeah. Now, one of the things that we do talk about on the program is how listeners can kind of decipher a recipe. There are so many, I want to say viral recipes. That's not always it, but there's so many recipes available to people. And I think a lot of times you think, okay, is this going to turn out? And so in your eyes, because you are a recipe developer and you have been a, editor, what are the things that you look for when you're scanning through and looking at a recipe? Is there something that kind of jumps out at you of like, yeah, that's not going to work? Or, wow, this is laid out in a really great way. What are things that people can kind of keep an eye out for?
Yeah. It's interesting because there are so many different ways that I think about this. If I'm going to follow a recipe to the letter, I generally want some kind of gatekeeping going on and I know that term can mean many things, but what I mean is that I want someone to have vetted the recipe. And that happens in publications. I still definitely go with cookbooks. There are websites that have editors that are testing those recipes so that that they worked, or at least bringing an expertise and an understanding of who this writer is and whether their flavors are going to work. But beyond that, if I'm going to a specific person for a recipe, it's because I have tried something out and I know that I like what they make. Because I think that everyone has a slightly different flavor that they want in their food. And you have to like the flavors that you're getting from someone. I mean, there are some very well-known, excellent recipe developers who I don't cook from because we don't like the same things in our food. Beyond that, what I consider a good recipe comes from like the way that people describe things and the creativity they describe them with. Can I imagine what this texture is that they're talking about? Like Helen Rosner has a recipe where she says like, add more black pepper than you think you would ever need, and then add more again. And she's trying to tell you like, you need a flavor here and you need to like lean on the black pepper for the flavor. Or I was editing a recipe. I edit for the Mala Markets recipe site. And I was editing a recipe the other day that will go up shortly. And the writer had said she took a whole cabbage and cut it in half at the waist. And it never would have occurred to me to describe it that way. But she means literally cut it in half at the place where the waist would be on this long Napa cabbage. And I thought that is such a good way of putting it. I understand that instruction really well. Mm-hmm. And as an editor, that's what I'm always looking for if I'm editing a recipe. I want to really know what you mean. I don't care if you think it takes 3 minutes to cook. On my stove, it might take 2. My flame might be, the high on my stove might be higher than yours, or my wok might be thinner or thicker than yours, or my Dutch oven is old and isn't heating evenly, whatever it is. I think that a recipe that explains what you're looking for at each step is going to give you success a lot more easily than something that looks short and easy, because you won't know if you're doing it right all along the way. So you won't know if you've caramelized properly, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost like guideposts or, you know, yeah. Yeah, those are good things. Because I know, I think a lot of times, you know, you, when you read through, you're like, I don't know what I'm really supposed to do now. You know, and it's like, what am I actually looking for? Or so, yeah, I can understand that. I love the waist thing, cut it at the waist. That's such an interesting.
So smart.
Yeah, that is so clever.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably not how other people look for recipes. I know that, you know, if a recipe isn't great, but I like the ideas in the recipe, I can sort of do a version, right? But so, you know, sometimes I'm just scanning for ideas. But if I'm thinking about like what makes a quote unquote good recipe, I want to learn something, or I want to be really clear about what that person means. You know, what does brown mean to this cook? You know, if you're going to brown meat, like how brown do they mean you need it to be?
Yeah. And I think that too, those types of things can really keep the humanness in a recipe. You know, we can talk about AI if you want, but I just see more and more like little funny things on, I don't know, whether it's Facebook or somewhere, and you are reading through and thinking, is this created by a robot? Because it's so, I don't want to say bizarre, but sometimes kind of bizarre. But I think that those things that you're talking about kind of bring it back to, okay, this is created by somebody who actually made this and tested it and knows what to look for and wants you to know what to look for. And
yeah. Well, and I think the other piece of that is that because recipe writing appeared in print for so long, in magazines and newspapers specifically, we developed this way of crunching the instruction down so that it was as concise as possible, because you don't have a lot of room. And so a lot of, like, it would be very easy for an AI to learn that language set, the thing where we drop all the articles and we don't describe what we're doing and we just use a time. And it's, you know, it works in context, you know, if you're reading the same magazine over and over. Like at Sever, there was a small enough readership that we had the sense that people learned how we thought to a degree. And I think that's true if you follow a blog or any website regularly. You come to understand what that writer means when they describe something because they're naturally using the same language over and over. But now that things are on the internet, like there's time, there's room. Why not explain yourself? And I think that that's true. That's the kind of language that is very human and would be hard to replicate. And you know that there is, and someone has taken the time to think about that. How do I describe this sauce? What does this actually look like when I'm looking at it in the pan? And that's a lot of care that has gone into that recipe.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really think about that with magazines. I guess with newspapers or any printed anything, you do want it kind of condensed because paper, space.
Right.
But which makes me think, is that why a lot of recipes leave out articles?
I think that's definitely where it originated from.
Yeah.
Now when people, I mean, sometimes for cookbooks, like my book, I wanted to keep the recipes fairly short because you don't want it to look unapproachable. Like that's a different reason to keep things short, is that if you write a 3-page recipe, it might look like something people won't even take the time to read through because they're like, oh, that's complicated. I don't need complicated right now. So you do have to strike that balance. But I think the way that a lot of sites do it, in order to, I mean, for various SEO reasons also, but in order to keep the recipe concise, is they give you all the hints up top, like here's what we mean about washing rice, or here's what you need to know about the way we're cutting these vegetables. And then later on, they can make a recipe that looks very approachable, and they've given you a lot of information up top.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I mean, I know I even do that. Sometimes I will look at a recipe, and I won't name any names, but sometimes you look at it and you think, I don't have that kind of time, because the directions look so long. But that can be misleading because I'll read through it and think, okay, this doesn't actually take that much time, but there was so much explaining, to do.
Right.
Yeah, I can see why there would be other reasons as well for condensing that and making that kind of approachable.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's where finding people whose work you trust is really helpful. If you go to David Leibovitz or whoever for your recipes, you know that, if there's a mistake in there, he doesn't know that mistake is there. Like that was an actual, I mean, and that happens in everything, books and magazines also. Like, someone's finger slips and some, 1.5 becomes 12 suddenly. We had that happen at the magazine once, 12 tablespoons of butter. No, half a tablespoon of butter. So, there are always going to be mistakes in everything. But if you find someone with a lot of expertise and you trust their recipes, then it doesn't matter if it looks long. You know that it's only long because they're explaining, because you know their tone.
Yeah. Well, now you have done obviously a lot of recipe editing as well, because some listeners are actually also recipe writers. What do you feel like is something that should really be paid attention to in maybe developing recipes, or even in, I don't know what I'm asking actually.
I mean, I personally don't think that dropping all the articles and everything is all that helpful. I think the more conversational recipes are really helpful. I also find that even as an editor, like I have to go through with a copy editor brain on to be like, did I use all of these ingredients in the order that I said I was going to use them? There's like the going back and checking thing. Did I forget to say, did I, take slicing out of the, ingredient list and need to put it in the first instruction and then forget to do that? Is there an ingredient that I prepped that should have gone in this long list of 8 things you're all putting in the pot together and only 7 of those things show up in that list at the bottom. It's this very technical, tricky thing to do. But I think because it's so technical and mathematical, we sort of, anytime you write, you can't catch your own mistakes. You look at it and you see what you were thinking when you were writing it, and you don't see that you accidentally, left out the comma or whatever it is. Like, you just get back in the mind frame of what you wrote. And that's why even editors do not edit themselves. But that's true of recipes also. And it's really tricky these days, because if we're having our own Substack, you can't pay someone to edit for you unless you have a whole bunch of paid subscribers, or some other, brand deal or something else going on. So I think that maybe that skill set will become more popular, like learning how to really edit recipes. But I find that I have to really take a step back. And if I don't have time to read it the next day, I have to email it to my husband or my mom or someone and be like, where are the mistakes? I know they're in here and I just can't see them right now.
Yeah. Yeah, an interesting trend, and I don't know if this is actually a trend, but something that I have noticed with some recipes, and I'm kind of on the fence, and I would be interested to see what you think about this, is I have seen some where they have the ingredient list up at the top, and then you have the directions, but then in the directions, those ingredients are repeated, so you don't have to scroll back up or look back up to see, wait, how much baking soda do I need? Because it's right there. Have you seen that, and what do you think about that?
I've seen that, and it's, none of the things I edit for in the way that I write, I don't have that in necessarily. But I do think it can be very helpful. So I think it just depends who your audience is. If you're gonna be working with a bunch of people who, are gonna mise en place all their stuff out and are gonna pre-measure, and that of your audience, then I don't know that it would make your recipes longer and harder to just scan the instruction really quickly, because sometimes, especially if you've got a hot pan going or something, you want them to be able to absorb that next step as quickly as possible into their brain and look back at the pan. But I think in other instances it could be very useful. One of the things that I was trained to do that I think everybody should do is, at the very least, don't say the remaining salt. Say like the remaining half teaspoon of salt. Don't make people do mental math, right?
Yeah.
And that is sort of a step toward that. But yeah, I think it could be really useful. And I think that if your recipe is simple enough, you can just skip the ingredient list and bold all of the ingredients and their measurements in the recipe itself. Obviously that doesn't work if you need to go shopping for a whole bunch of ingredients, but it's, we used to, at Severo, we would call it a method if it was just written into a box and not written out in multiple steps. So I think it just depends. I think it depends on who the cook is and the tone you want to set as the person developing the recipe.
Thank you for weighing in on that, because I had seen that and I was like, oh, this is very interesting. I haven't seen this before, but
yeah, no, you're right. I've seen it, but I'm just thinking it through. But you're right. It's a very, I don't know if it's a trend right now. I could ask I have some friends who track this kind of thing. I might have to ask like Kate Lee here or something if she's noticed it.
Well, now I know that you have a couple of newsletters. You have the Snacking Dinners newsletter that is tied to your book and just sharing the things about your book, but you also have another newsletter as well.
Yeah,
the California table. Yay, California!
Yes. Yeah, and that's how we connected, I think, right? Through that newsletter originally.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about your California Table newsletter? It's so beautiful. I love the things that you do on that too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. It started out as a pandemic idea. I have always thought, and I've written about this, that there was no like California book. Like you can find a book that says like, oh, the foods of New England, or like the beautiful book, The Midwestern Table, that came out a few years ago. And I kept thinking like all the California books especially when I was living in New York and wasn't here to be absorbing it all. Um, California food came through the restaurant lens. All the books were restaurant books, and that's not how people cook. You know, the Jelena book is amazing, but you have to make a whole bunch of recipes in order to make the recipe because they have the freedom and the time and the staff to make all their own sauces and all these things, and that's how most restaurants operate. So I kept thinking, like, why isn't there a book about how we actually cook in California, how my friends and family cook? And I realized in 2020, as I started to think about it more after the job I had at the time kind of fell apart, like everybody's work did, um, that it's because there is no one California cuisine. We're
Mm-hmm.
just, we've never hit a moment where immigration stopped. And in most of the country, immigration is marked by few massive waves, you know, and those communities established themselves and developed a food. And then whoever came after that was
Mm-hmm.
building on top of an already developed cuisine of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And in California, the only time that ever happened was when the Spanish came. We went straight from native food to sort of the Spanish through the lens of Mexico and Mexican ingredients, um, food of the Californios. Then suddenly everybody came and they never stopped coming. And so we had everything all at once. And what we developed was this incredible place to eat, and all these incredible ingredients got planted here. And people started eating what their neighbors were eating, and they started finding ingredients they never would have found. But so we never developed a like California cuisine unless it was like the 80s, early 90s, and that meant a specific kind of fine dining in the sort of Alice Waters lens. But it's so I realized that I couldn't write a book, and what I needed was to start collecting recipes. And so I still hope that someday it will be a book of recipes, like a community cookbook, many, many people's recipes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I also realized when I started that kind of research that I wanted to tell more stories than would fit in a cookbook. So in the California Table newsletter, it started out as just interviews and then a recipe that I would get from the people I interviewed. Um, Always about home cooking. Even if I'm talking to a chef, I ask about what they cook at home. And now it has evolved to where it is sometimes that, because it turns out that that is a very time consuming thing to do on a free newsletter, to interview people and transcribe and do an as told to and test their recipe and photograph it. And doing that weekly was definitely not happening. So it's a combination of that. And I will excerpt cookbooks that are coming out. Sometimes I interview the authors of those cookbooks as well. And then a handful of the recipes have started more frequently to be recipes from my kitchen. And that wasn't the original intention, but I'm trying to balance it. Because I do cook in California. I do think that people want home cooking recipes.
Mm-hmm.
I cook from a variety of traditions just because of all the people I've learned from over the years. And so it's not as frequent. The Snacking Dinners newsletter, there is a snacky dinner every week. There is a recipe every week, and it is consistently a snacking dinner. The California Table is less consistent, but it has these longer stories that people have shared with me. And it offers this window into California now, California of the past, if people are talking about things that their great 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 grandparents did. And so it's just so much fun to do. And whenever I can do that, it's just endlessly interesting to hear
Yeah.
about the history of California food through the lens of one family or one person.
Mm. And I love the way that you described that of how, in our state, we do have this continual influx of new people from all over the world, and they're all kind of contributing to the different cuisine here. And you're right. I think there really is no one California cuisine. I mean, I think I say that I write about California cuisine, but I really write about Southern California cuisine, honestly,
Mhm.
because, you know, Northern California is, you live there. It's a little different. I mean, there's
Mhm.
different influences, and We don't have chez panisse here,
Oh, but you have some other great things.
we do, but it is different, and I think it's funny because people in other parts of the nation, they have this view of maybe what California is like, and it's so varied and so diverse and so many different influences. So yeah, so I love it. But yeah, whenever you post a recipe in California Table, or even just an interview, the interviews, like you said, people's stories, always so interesting. So
I'm so
I
glad.
love that.
The reason I work in food is because I like culture, and I am endlessly fascinated by what human beings come up with in this like weird, we like create culture everywhere we go, and there's similarities and there's differences, and it's and these threads start to emerge, and I ask people essentially the same questions every time, and then we get off on whatever tangent is appropriate for their story. But one of the things that people consistently say when I ask them how cooking in California is different from either where they moved from or where they went to college or some other place that they live in, or even just their sense of California. Um, the two things that come up almost always are fresh produce, which we have in
Yeah.
abundance, including like fresh seafood that also comes up, the proximity to the sea, but the freshness of the food and the mashing together of the neighborhoods and of all the influences, or even if your neighbors were all vaguely from the same area or same socioeconomic status, there were the restaurants you grew up around were varied enough, where the kids in your school came from all kinds of different backgrounds. So those two things seem to be what mark California food. We have fresh food, and we have a massive variety of influences.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of food, tell us a little bit about just the tried and true recipe that you wanted to share with listeners. And I'll put the links in the show notes so it can be really from a past newsletter, or it can be from your new book, whatever you want to share. But tell us a little bit about a tried and true recipe that you love and wanted to share with people.
Sure. I mean, there were two different things. One is tried and true, and one was brand new that I'm obsessed with. If that's okay to share
Yeah.
two things, is that all right?
Yeah.
So the tried and true is from the California Table, and it's we love the Zuni chicken. They at Zuni, the restaurant, they at Zuni Cafe, they roast a whole chicken in this beautiful wood burning hearth, and they serve it over this salad that's full of croutons, and it has capers and scallions and pine nuts all worked in. Um, and we love it, but it's not like you can go out to eat like that very regularly. And there are only three of us in the house. So I've tried doing the big chicken before, and I can always use up extra chicken. But it's very time consuming when you do the whole recipe.
Mm.
And so what I do instead is I do chicken thighs. And that way, while the chicken thighs are in the oven or even in the pan, skin side down to crisp, I do it that way sometimes. And so the in between time is when you make your croutons and you tear up the lettuces for your salad and mix up a dressing. It takes like a little extra effort just because you have to like tear up bread and throw it in the toaster oven or even in the oven with the chicken. And then you saute the scallions a little bit and throw the some garlic and some other things, the pine nuts and all the things into that pan. So it feels like it's more of a production, but it really isn't. Like if you're roasting chicken thighs, and that takes what, 20, 30 minutes depending on how you do it and the size of the chickens that you're sourcing from, that is plenty of time to put together a slightly elaborate salad dressing
Yeah.
and make croutons. So we do that a lot. My daughter loves it, and she's the kind of California kid who I'm always like, no more salad until you eat some protein. So having the two things combined and then the croutons makes everybody really happy.
Yeah.
Um,
That sounds
and the
delicious.
second, yeah, it is, and it's easy. And it was a very popular one when I posted it. So I know that speaks to other people too. The like simplification of something so delicious. And then the second recipe is one that I came up with recently for the Snacking Dinners newsletter, not the book. It's like a Reuben sandwich, but it's a quesadilla. So it's a Reuben quesadilla, and the idea came from like an appetizer book that I have, and I just sort of took that idea and ran with it. And my father's family's Jewish, so there's a sort of Jewish deli history in my family. Whenever we would go visit relatives, we'd get these foods. Sometimes if I'm out with my in-laws, we'll do the same. But like a Reuben sandwich is incredibly delicious and speaks to my heritage, but it's so much meat. And we just don't eat that much meat anymore. And it's, you don't feel great after that amount of fat. It's a very fatty meat.
Yeah.
And the coleslaw or the sauerkraut or however, if there are various variations, but the sauerkraut or whatever that goes into it helps cut that while you're eating it. But it's still just, my dad and I split it and it's still too much food. So this was perfect because I could buy like less than a half a pound of the meat, and then you use the cheese as the cheese in the quesadilla and put as much of the sauerkraut in as I wanted. And I made the Thousand Island dressing and I used it as like a dip or a drizzle, depending, and everybody could add as much of it as they liked. And that flew in my kitchen. And we just love it because it's all the same flavors, but it's, less animal protein for us and the environment. Easy, fun finger food. So I'm excited about that, and that has become a very quickly become a regular thing.
Those both sound fantastic. I could eat both of those right now. Yum! Thank you so much. I will put links to both of those in the show notes too.
Thank you.
So where's the best place, as we wrap up, where's the best place for people to connect with you online? Where do you like them to go to see what you're doing and also to connect with you?
Yeah, the Snacking Dinners newsletter is definitely where I'm spending the most time right now. In part because of the launch of the book, and occasionally there's book news on there, but also it's just such a fun project to do. And I think it really speaks to people. So it's snackingdinners.com. It's through Substack, so you can find it that way. But we went out and made sure I had the domain first. And it's a free newsletter, so anyone can message, anyone can comment. And I've been really having a good time connecting with people over that idea of dinner being fun.
That's great. Well, thank you, Georgia, so much for being on the podcast today. It's such a pleasure to see you and meet you and talk to you. And I just so appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun to get to speak in person, and thank you for letting me ramble on about my book. It's a fun project and I'm excited to let it into the world. So I really appreciate that opportunity.
Thank you so much.